Hey y'all. So here we are in week 2 of being at home and trying to kind of figure all this stuff out, and handle everything we need to do for class and everything. So thank y'all for being patient and for submitting your journals, those of y'all who did, and for commenting on the other video. And so this week I'm going to do kind of the same thing, just kind of try to do a summary of the readings and some of the things I want y'all to just kind of be thinking about. And then hopefully y'all can comment on this video, just something to let me know that you watched it. I hope that these are useful to y'all. So I have a few things. First, I just kind of wanted to real briefly comment on your journal entry. So I read the ones that were there, and just kind of the gist that I was getting from them was, seemed like a few of y'all thought the Gautreaux piece was a little bit wordy, which I can see I kind of agree with, but I guess I've read enough of his stuff to know that this is nothing compared to some of his other stories. In fact, I used to use a couple of other ones in my class, and stopped because they were way more, as y'all said, wordy, or I think Alex said it was very verbose. So I don't like to put y'all through that. So, but I can see where y'all are coming from with that. It is a long story, and it'd be interesting. And maybe in the future that could be an assignment, not for us, but in future courses where we take a story like this and cut half of it and see how different the story is. What could we take out? Make it a 10-page story. So that's something to think about. Maybe the story doesn't need to be as long as it is. For the Carver story, it seemed like a lot of y'all were commenting on the structure, which I'm happy about. But some of y'all were saying that it was confusing. You didn't know who the speaker was, or how those interruptions really helped the story, and if anything, maybe it made it more confusing. And I think Alex, again, to pick on you, I liked your comments where you mentioned Salinger, and you're probably thinking of the same quote that I was. At the end of The Catcher in the Rye, when he says, "Don't ever tell anybody anything. If you do, you start missing everybody," or something like that. And that does seem to be kind of the theme of the Carver piece. And I wrote this as a comment, Alex, on your journal, but sort of the futility of telling stories, not just fiction, but even when we talk to someone, a friend or a family member, and we're sharing something that was really significant or important to us, and then they just don't get it. And it seems like the narrator of the Raymond Carver stories and then as a result, Raymond Carver himself as a writer is commenting on that. But even still, we sit down at the typewriter every day and we try to tell the stories and to get readers to understand what we're saying. And I love that line at the end of The Catcher in the Rye. We see, in Carver, it's at the end of a very short little piece where he says, something like, "I wish I hadn't told her this because she doesn't get it." But then in Salinger's case, he's written a whole novel, and at the very end, Holden Caulfield says, "Don't ever tell anybody anything." And presumably, maybe he is in a mental institution. We don't know where he's narrating that novel, but and maybe the mistake he made was telling people too much about how he felt, and then he ended up where he ended up. I don't know, but I like that. And one of y'all mentioned in your journal the sort of metafictional elements of the story, and those are certainly there. So I'm glad that y'all are seeing all those things and commenting on them. It always makes me glad to see that y'all are appreciating the things and getting why I'm assigning them. one last little comment before I move on to this week's stuff. Paige commented on last week's video and was asking about how, or if readers appreciate knowing that a story is based on real life. And I responded to that in the video from last week if y'all are interested. Just real short, yes, I think they always appreciate finding out that stories are based on real life. And I pointed out the quote from the Gautreaux story where he says, it's not fair to readers to write about things that you don't know about. So the whole theme of that story, I would say, is write what you know. And that's kind of, what prompted the story. The guy, it starts off with him getting a 1-star review on Amazon because he wrote about something he didn't know about. And then the other example I always think of is Tim O'Brien, who wrote The Things They Carried. Great writer, and it's a really good book. But it's short stories, and a lot of people read those as nonfiction or memoir. And when they find out that some of the details were made up, they're disappointed. And that's kind of an understatement. I mean, some people have gotten very angry with Tim O'Brien for straying from what they thought was the truth. So the other part of Paige's question, which I didn't really address in the comment, she said something like, well, how do we write about things that really happen to us? How much detail should we include? How much should we leave out? And that really depends on your intent. Obviously, if you're writing a nonfiction piece or a memoir, you want to include as much as you can, as much as you remember of what happened. If you're turning it into fiction, I would say the same thing, but just you have a little bit more room to invent things for your story, dialogue or certain scenes or situations that can make it more engaging. And the key word, I guess, there is verisimilitude, close to the truth. But Paige, I'm sure you know by now, and all of y'all probably by now, that I love reading, and most readers, not just me, but most readers, I think, love reading fiction that comes from true things that actually happened. A lot of my fiction is very autobiographical. And again, that's the whole idea of writing what you know. And I always kind of give the little addition to that comment and saying that, you can write about what you want to know as well. There's not a rule that says you can't learn about new things and then write about those. So anyway, hopefully that kind of answers that question, and I appreciate the question. So hopefully anytime y'all have comments or things like that with your own writing, please ask them. I mean, that's what the class is for. So to move on, I assigned this week 2 essays about a writer, Larry Brown, who's, surprisingly, one of my favorite writers. I'm sure y'all all would have thought I would have said Stephen King, and I mean, certainly he's up there, but Larry Brown, for the reason that he's from Mississippi, he's had a similar life, I think, to mine. And then also the types of things that he writes, all those things kind of put him up there as, probably top 3 favorite writers. And I thought, instead of getting y'all, at some point in the semester, we may read like an interview with a writer or an essay that a writer wrote about their process, since this is a craft class. But I thought it might be kind of interesting and different to read some pieces about a writer and about that writer's life and work. So that's what those 2 essays are about, and they both, if you notice, sort of hone in on the idea that Larry Brown never went to college. He doesn't have an MFA, or didn't have an MFA. And I think that's partly the appeal that he had to a lot of people. He was sort of a self-made writer. He was a firefighter. He did all these other odd jobs. And one day decided, I want to write a novel. And so he borrowed his wife's typewriter and sat down and wrote a novel. And of course, it took him many more of those before he was able to find a publisher. And you'll see some of that in these essays, that journey that he sort of went on. If you're interested, I'm going to try to hold this up better than I did with the last time when I did that. I always get the angle wrong. Here we go. Larry Brown, A Writer's Life by Gene Cash. Great book. It's a biography, and it goes into way more detail about how he started off and sort of his process in finding people to publish his work and getting an audience. And then there's the documentary. The Oxford American piece is actually written by the guy who filmed the documentary. It's called The Rough South of Larry Brown. And if we were meeting in person, I would put the DVD on the symposium and show it to you. But since we're not able to do that, the video is hard to find. I had to go all over the place to order a copy. But you can find clips of it on YouTube if you're interested. Just type The Rough South of Larry Brown and you'll pull up some clips. He has a real thick Mississippi accent, which I love to hear. Sounds like a very down-home kind of guy. But anyway, if you're interested more about him, there's that stuff. And then, of course, the actual books that he wrote. And just look him up on Amazon. Dirty Work, his first novel, great book. Faye, Joe. He has collections of short stories, a collection of essays, a memoir about being a firefighter. And then there was a novel published after he passed away that's incomplete but still kind of interesting, called A Miracle of Catfish. And then just recently a new collection of short stories came out with, I think, previously unpublished stories called Tiny Love. And the LitHub article that I have on Moodle is kind of like early publicity, I guess, for that book. So there's like a little plug for it at the bottom. So there's a lot of stuff out there. But anyway, hopefully you can see why I assigned those two essays. Hopefully you think they're interesting. When I was first really serious about writing, one of the things I did in addition to reading a lot of fiction was read those types of things, like about other writers. And I read a lot of biographies of writers. I read, you can't really find this much anymore, but letters when writers used to write to their editors or whatever, and sometimes if they're real famous, you can find like a book of their correspondence. Those things are invaluable to me, and they should be to you too as a writer, because you can get a little bit about the process of writing and what the life of a writer is like, and you can't get that anywhere else. So check those things out. And I'm in the position where I can sort of show you those things and get you to read them. But on your own, look those up. See if writers that you like, if there's things written about them, or if there's like correspondences that they've shared that are published. Interviews. Like I mentioned before, I might assign an interview with a writer for you to check out, because those are really useful. What I want you to focus your journal on for this week is the idea that, both of these essays kind of talk about the idea that a writer can be successful and be self-taught, like Larry Brown, who just sat down one day at a typewriter and wrote a novel. Certainly it's not that simple, but I want you to, and it's weird for me as somebody who makes his living as a teacher, teaching writing, and here I am saying that I'm sort of enamored with the idea that you can teach yourself how to write. I think workshops are great. I think MFA programs are great and important. But there's so many writers out there, and 30 years ago, a lot of people wouldn't even know what an MFA was. Now it's very common, and most writers who you see who've published books have an MFA. But that's not to say, I mean, you can learn a lot by just going to the library and reading a lot. That's what Larry Brown did. So I want you to talk about that in your journal. There's no right or wrong answer, but just talk about, do you think, that writers like doctors or lawyers or whatever need to be trained as professionals, or can a writer teach himself or herself how to write? Certainly we wouldn't want a doctor operating on us who just taught him or herself out of a book, but writing is a little bit different. So just think about those things, and that's what I want you to respond to in your journal. And then talk about how, based on those articles, how did Larry Brown train himself as a writer? How do you train yourself as a writer? In addition to going to this class, taking other classes, or being in a writer's group or whatever, what else do you do? So there's no right or wrong response to that, but I'm just hopefully can start a conversation, because I love reading those. I don't respond to all of them, but I do read them all, and I'm happy to see them. And then I try to comment on them here as well. So the very last thing that I want to talk about real quick, and I know if y'all were in my 372 class, we did this same thing. You will notice, though, that I made it a little bit harder because it used to be 250 words for a piece of flash fiction. I changed it now to 150 because I want to challenge you. I want you to see if you can write a story that's that short and make it successful. And so I was going to read to you real quick. So all this stuff is on Moodle. All the same stuff. In fact, if you were in 372, you've seen all this before. There's some websites with flash fiction on them that you can read. There's a handout with a bunch of really, really short stories that you can read. Some of them have images that go with them. So look at those and hopefully get inspired, get some samples of what I'm looking for. But what I wanted to kind of just skim with you real quick is one of the handouts on Moodle. I think it's called How to Write Flash Fiction. I think that's what or it's called A Guide to Writing Flash Fiction. That's what I have there on Moodle. But when you click it, it opens a Word document, and it just gives you some 6 pointers. And so I'm going to read those 6 and just real quick talk about them. And there's a lot more information on the sheet, but and these aren't set rules. They're just suggestions. Because as I'm reading this first one, we might not think this is the best advice, but the first, I guess, rule or suggestion is start in the middle, in medias res. I think kind of what the suggestion more is don't worry about giving us a whole bunch of background of the characters or the scene. Just jump right into the story. Drop us right into the middle of the restaurant where the characters are talking. Kind of like Chris did with his dialogue assignment. In fact, a lot of those work as flash fiction. But I don't want y'all to use those. I want you to do a new piece. Don't use too many characters. Obviously, if you're writing a story that's 150 words, you probably don't want more than 2 people in it. 3 tops. Again, as I say that, I realize that somebody might try to put 6 or 7 and might succeed. So I don't want y'all to think I'm telling you these are things you can't do. But it's probably a little more difficult to deal with more characters in such a short piece. Make sure the ending isn't at the end. I think kind of what he's talking about there is kind of like the Carver piece or even the Gautreaux piece. Gautreaux never tells us at the end of the story whether the guy gives Zeno a 5-star review. He's hovering over that 5th star. But we don't know, and we can only speculate. What does he do? So your end of your flash fiction piece should be like that. Give us some ambiguity, the iceberg effect. Just show us what's at the very top of the surface, and all the rest of it we can figure out. Number 4, he says sweat your title. You have 150 words. I'll give you the title as being, so if your story is 150 and then you have a 3-word title, that's okay. The title doesn't count as your word count. Don't make your title 100 words, but, make it something that's important. I like 1-word titles myself because they can mean, you have to trust the language that you're using, the words that you're using. And to me, as a writer, obviously words have power. And if you have faith in that, you can put a 1-word title on your story and know, or at least trust, that the reader's going to understand the multiple meanings of your story, or of the title, rather. Number 5, he says, make your last line ring like a bell. I don't really care for the cliche, but what he's saying again is it should resonate. Like the line, I read The Catcher in the Rye when I was 15, and I can still remember those last lines. Don't ever tell anybody anything. If you do, you start missing everyone. That's the last line that you remember. And so that's a novel, obviously, but even for flash fiction or poetry, I was talking about the value of reading poetry, writing poetry. Those last lines resonate. And so your last line of this story should resonate, should leave the reader thinking about the meaning of your story and the purpose of it and all that good stuff. And then number 6, the last suggestion that he gives on that handout, he says, write long, then go short. And that's just, sort of a technique, I guess, editorial technique, is don't worry about 150 words when you're writing. Write it as long as you need it to be, and then go back and cut it later. That could teach you a little bit about, the necessary details and what might work and not work in a piece. So those are just some suggestions. Again, there's a bunch of other stuff, places where you at some point might even think about submitting. That very first one, Flash Fiction Press, I had a student a couple of years ago submit to them, and they published her piece. They're not reading anymore. I think in 2017 the guy said they kind of stopped reading submissions. Thankfully the site is still there. So you can read the pieces published, but they're not open to new stuff. But Fiction Southeast is. I'm not sure about a 100-word story, one of the other links. But yeah, hopefully y'all are thinking about submitting the things that you write for this class. When you do finish your piece, please, there's a little discussion board at the bottom where I want you to submit, and then I ask that you respond to at least 3 other pieces. So I'm not going to make you respond to all of them, but just give a couple of comments, what you liked about it, what maybe could be changed or fixed, and keep it positive, just like we always do in class. But all this stuff, I know it seems like a lot, but I like to post it on Monday to give you a whole bunch of time to do it. But try to get it all done by Sunday, this coming Sunday. So 6 days by midnight. If you have questions, send me an email. If you have any concerns, send me an email. And hopefully y'all comment on the video. I like reading your comments. I try to respond to everything. Especially if you ask questions, I'm going to respond to those. So I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks for taking the time. I think I took a little bit more time than I wanted. That always happens, but stay in touch and just be safe, y'all. Thanks.